Hello and welcome to the 10th episode of the Eternal Top 10 series. In this series I talk about the 10 cards with the most competitive success in Eternal's history that fulfill a certain condition. In this case they had to be a campaign card. For that I compiled a list of all decks that topped an official Direwolf event or reached top 8 in the ETS seasons of 2017 and 18. The ranking is then based on a point system. Each tier 1 top grants 2 points and each tier 2 top grants 1. Tiers are either based on how far the deck went or on how important the event was. For more detailed explanation, check out the introduction video on my channel. Usually I take all data from 2017 to 2022 into account, but this is a seasonal episode, which means that I will only use tournament results from one specific season, in this case 2020. Campaign cards include all cards that are exclusively available as part of a bundle of around 20 cards that you have to buy with either gold or gems. It doesn't matter if that bundle has a single player campaign that you have to compete to unlock these cards. That means bundles where you get the cards immediately after purchase, like Shadow of the Spire, are included. I didn't include the insignias that were part of the Trials of Chekov bundle though, because they only stayed campaign exclusive until the release of set 7 Flames of Xulta in late 2019. Campaign cards always had a huge impact on the meta, often to the point of being necessary purchases for anyone who wanted to compete, which will be reflected in the point totals that the cards on this list gathered in just one season. As always, feel free to write your guesses about which cards make the top of the list, or your questions about how close some cards that you expected to see missed out in the comments. And with that, let's begin. First up we have Stormhold Knife. It's a 6-power double justice influence rare 5/5 relic weapon that is free, which includes the influence cost, while you have 10 or less life. Stormhold Knife was a staple in mid-range decks and control main decks and markets since its release in early 2019, thanks to its ability to stabilize against aggressive decks, and the trend continued in 2020, its strongest season. At the start of the season it was played in the markets of the strong mid-range decks from the 2019 season, FGS midrange and Rakano Valkyries, and in the market of Archenport midrange and main deck of FTJ midrange / control, the later of which usually prefer to play a time market, but still wanted the stabilizing potential of Knife to make up for a very top heavy curve, so they had to play it in the main deck. Towards the later end of the season it dropped off a bit, even though strong Justice Influence payoffs got released. It still had some tops in the market of Rakano Influence and Horu and Archenport Kira decks, but most of the time Kira players went for different options in the market flex spots instead, like Mantle of Justice or Sweatia Lightbringer. But Knife stayed a staple in the main decks of Justice control decks from the start to the end of 2020, most importantly in Horu and FGP control, the later of which won Worlds in the hands of Lights Out Ace. On rank 9 we have another Justice card, Silverblade Intrusion. It's a 1-power 1 Justice Influence rare fast spell that gives 2 of your units invulnerable to damage this turn, and that creates and draws a 5-cost 3/3 Valkyrie Denouncer with Revenge if you have at least 6 Justice Influence. Intrusion was released halfway into the 2020 season as part of the massively influential Shadow of the Spire campaign. At release it was way more powerful than the still strong version we have today. It could not just run Enforcer if you had 5, not 6 like today, Justice Influence, but it could also play another one in addition if the opponent had 4 more cards in hand. Despite that, Intrusion still didn't see a ton of play in the first Throne tournament it was legal for, the Spring Quarterly in May 2020, mostly because Justice heavy decks weren't well represented outside of a few Rakano Valkyrie decks, which always played 3 or 4 copies of Intrusion. The first breakthrough came after the release of Set 9, Arch and Devs, in June 2020, because it introduced strong payoffs and enablers for influence-heavy decks. The main ones for Justice were Trickshot Ruffian, Justice Etching, and Justice Symbol. Those 3 together, with Intrusion and Zedidi the Killing Steel and Iaria Valkyrie Captain, made up the core of Justice Influence decks in the first Throne ICQ after the release of Set 9, ICQ Dead or Alive. The most successful version was Rakano Influence, because it had additional influence accelerators in Ironthorn Lawman, who was a 3/2 back then, and Bullet Shaper, who was a 2-cost 2/3. And it had an additional payoff for Justice Influence in Ijin Walking Armory, who could also play the weapon on herself when she was summoned. So it wasn't another unit back then. In the weeks after that ICQ, most of those cards got nerfed though, but in early September, Justice Influence decks got a new build around that would end up defining the archetype until today: Kira Ascending. Even though Intrusion was one of the aforementioned nerfed cards, it became a 4-off staple in every Kira version. The nerf made it a bit slower, but it was still a powerful card on its own, and the fact that it could draw cards with Kira and Horror Envoy and trigger the renown on Hojan Groundbreaker made it incredibly powerful. The combination with Bubble Shield could lead to frustrating gamble situations for the opponent. Because you didn't know which of the two they had in hand, you had to guess if Marvel of Tundras or Valkyrie Enforcer was the better removal in any current spot, and the fact that they could get a card and negate your removal if you guessed incorrectly could decide games. Kira decks remained strong until the end of the season, despite her getting nerfed from 3-2 down to 2-1, including 2 spots in the top 8 of Worlds, so Intrusion remained heavily played and thrown. In Expedition it was way less successful. Rakano Influence was very strong after the release of Z9, but it got nerfed hard before the first big Expedition tournament, so it didn't really get any points. And Horo Kira, the dominant version of Kira and Throne, was missing too many pieces to shine in Expedition. Archenbot Kira, which was also played in Throne, although way less than Horo Kira, had some success in Expedition though, and that's where most of Intrusion's points come from. Next up we have Honor of Claws. It's a 4-power, 1 primal influence uncommon spell that draws 3 cards and then discards 1. It was released in the Homecoming campaign in early 2019, so it wasn't Expedition legal in 2020, but it still managed to get enough points from Throne alone. Paying 4 to end up with just 1 more card in hand was quite expensive, even back in 2020, but the fact that you could discard the worst card in hand could already make up for it, and pretty much every deck with Honor had ways to cheat around the downside. In all Honor decks, you could discard Jotun Hurler, who used to draw Snowball when drawn instead of 2 on summon, for 3 card advantage. Same for Xo, who drew a Treasure Trove on Faith, in decks that also played fire like Skycrack or FGP Control. In all Honor decks with Shadow Influence, you could also discard Felrauk the Outcast, whose resummon effect from the Void used to not cast any power, for even more card advantage, and Feln and JPS Reanimator decks, which had a lot of success at the start of the season, could use the discard effect to set up their Void for big reanimation turns with Vara, Asindel and Black Sky Harbinger. All those synergies and the fact that it was still okay even if you just discarded the worst card in your hand made Honor of Claws a staple in some primal midrange and most primal control decks in 2020. From a Throne-only card, we come to a card that was almost exclusively played in Expedition in 2020, Aurelian Supplier. He's a 3-power, 1 fire and 1 time influence, rare 2/2 unit with charge, and on summon he draws a card if you have less cards in hand than the opponent, and or he draws a card if you have more units than the opponent. Both conditions were easier to achieve if you played an aggressive deck with cheap units and cards that summon multiple units. That is reflected in the decks he had success with. His few Throne tops come from Braxis Aggro and Braxis and FTS token decks, and in Expedition he was also exclusively played in Aggro and token decks. In Z8 Expedition he first showed up in the infamous FTS Sacrifice deck that dominated the Spring Quarterly on May 9th, just 5 days after Supplier's release in the Shadow of the Spire campaign. That deck played a lot of cheap units and even had ways to resummon Supplier and other units with summon effects, like Jack Mercenary Hunter or Kato Arena Herald. The most important way to resummon them was Aromod's Machinations, which used and now again does cost 5 power and only 1 time and 1 shadow influence. The immense success of the deck led to nerfs to several key cards, including Aromod's Machinations, Kato and Unfamiliar Interloper, just 2 days after the tournament. Those nerfs made FTS Sacrifice way weaker, which meant that the ICQ Shadow of the Spire, which was held 2 weeks after the Spring Seasonal, had a completely new meta. The most played deck in that meta was Braxis Aggro, and Supplier was one of the main reasons for success. In Z9, FTS Sacrifice with Supplier made a bit of a comeback, including an ICQ win in the hands of Apple Chips. But most of Supplier's Expedition tops in Z9 format come from FTP Mother of Skies decks. It was the most represented deck at the ICQ that Apple Chips won, ICQ Festivals of Inspiration in late August, with two main variants. The first, which Team CSB brought and which CDH played to a second place finish, was low to the ground with no units that cost more than 3, while the other version from Team Barbarian Camp included a small Stranger package, usually Linrai Stranger and Strange Gladiator, and it included Kenna Uncontained as a top end. Supplier was great in both variants. Both decks could empty the hand quite well, played a lot of tokens, and Supplier could trigger Mother of Skies to make it even more likely to draw at least one card. We go back to Justice Influence payouts with Iaria Valkyrie Captain. She's a 2-power double Justice Influence legendary 1/1 unit with flying and endurance. You can pay 3 for her ultimate, which plays a depleted Justice Sigil from your deck, and then buffs all Valkyries in your hand for +1/+1. And while you have 6 or more Justice Influence, she also gets +3/+2. She was released in early 2018 in the Dead Reckoning campaign, which was legal in Set 7 Expedition for a very short time, but in that format Justice heavy decks weren't well positioned, so she only got 4 tops in Horror Curses. In Throne she was very successful though. At the start of the season, she was played in Archenport and Rakano midrange/Valkyries decks, both of which played additional Valkyries like Valkyrie Enforcer, Zedidi, Magdo, and Rizan. So her ultimate could be of great use there. After the release of Shadow of the Spire, she was played in pretty much the exact same decks as Silverblade Intrusion, so I will shorten it a bit here. She was stable in Rakano, Horror, and Archenport influence decks in the July Throne ICQ, because she could speed up your Justice influence with her ultimate, while also being a payoff for Justice influence herself. In Horror and Archenport Kira, she had the same job, and in Horror Kira, her flying came in handy too, because it meant that she could deal some chip damage early on, and then threaten lethal later in combination with Trickshot Ruffian, the market copy of Mantle of Justice, or Kira's effect once you reached 8 Justice influence. On rank 5, we have Sabertooth Bright Leader. He is a 4-power double-time influence 3/5 uncommon unit with ambush, and on summon you can either destroy an enemy relic or gain 3 life. Bright Leader was released in mid-2019 in the Trials of Chekov campaign, which meant he wasn't legal in Expedition past the initial testing phase, which didn't have any official tournaments. So he doesn't have any expedition points. But thanks to his flexibility as both an anti-aggro tool and relic removal, he was a staple for time midrange and control decks and Throne throughout the whole season, which was enough to reach rank 5 on this list. At the start of the season he was, like Stormhold Knife, heavily played in the main deck of FT out midrange/control, because the deck needed stabilizers. After the release of Set 8, Echoes of Eternity, even Legion became the best deck, and Bright Leader was a main deck staple in it. He could swing games in a mirror match by killing Xen and Obelisk. He could also kill Shrine of Karavet against Sacrifice decks, or you could just ambush an Im and eat a smaller unit from the opponent that was attacking. After several nerfs to even Legion, he fell a bit out of favor, but he came back in Set 9 as the main deck or market option for different variants of Xen in midrange, although mostly as a tech choice rather than a staple. We are back in Shadow of the Spire with a number 4 spot, Turn to Seed. It's a 4-power double primal influence rare spell that transforms an enemy unit and each copy of it from their hand, deck and void into a 0/2 seed. The seeds are Mandrakes with an ultimate that buffs them by 5/5 at the start of the 5th turn after they enter the board. Turn to Seed did cost 3 power for almost all of the 2020 season, which meant it was decently efficient spot removal, at least for Expedition standards, that had the potential to be a 2, 3 or even 4 for 1 if the opponent drew multiple copies of a unit, which made it a very frustrating card to play against and a widely played card in both Expedition and Throne. In the later it was a staple in primal control decks, most importantly Horu, FGP and Felon at any cost, although thanks to the nerf shortly before the World Championship, it wasn't a part of the world-winning FGP control list from Lights Out Ace. Additionally, Turn to Seed was played in the market of some midrange decks like Elysian Spells or Horror midrange. In Expedition it was played in pretty much every primal midrange and control deck, most importantly Skycrack midrange, FTP tokens, and Horror Curses in Z8, and Skycrack, FPS, and FTP tokens, Elysian midrange, Monoprimal, and Elysian spells in Z9 format. On rank 3 we have our first card from Whispers of the Throne, Milos, Rebel Bomber. He's a 3-power double fire influence rare 3/3 unit with charge. When he hits the opponent, he puts a firebomb into their deck, and whenever the opponent gains life, he gains that much attack and health. Firebombs, of course, are 1-power fire spells with Destiny that deal 5 damage to the player who threw them. Milos was a staple in aggressive fire decks in both formats. The combination of charge, Overwhelm, which was taken away in late 2021, and an infiltrate-like effect meant that he had an immediate impact on the board, especially if played on curve, and the firebombs and the potential to get bigger if the opponent gained life, which was often necessary because the opponent played against an aggro deck, made him relevant in the mid to late game too. In Throne format, he had the additional upside of making the most common dual power insignias worse, at least against non-fire decks, because they would get depleted by the firebombs from Milos. In Throne, he was widely played in all fire aggro decks, most importantly Stonska, Skycrack, and Monofire. In Expedition, he was also one of the main reasons for the popularity of aggressive fire decks in both Z8 and 9 format. His most consistent homes there were Rakano and Brexis aggro in Z8, and Skycrack, Stonska, and Monofire aggro in Z9. And we continue with another Whispers of the Throne card, Blight Moth. It's a 3-power double shadow influence 1/2 uncommon unit with flying and corrupt 3, which means when it dies you get a 0/2 shade that loses 1 life at the end of your turn, and that you can sacrifice while paying 3 power to use the summon effect of Blight Moth again, and that summon effect reduces the attack and health of an enemy unit and all their units that share a type with it by 1. Blight Moth was nerfed to cost 3 instead of 2 at the end of the 2020 season, which mostly removed it from competitive play, but it was an absolute powerhouse in both formats before that. In Throne, it played a main role in the disappearance of Skycrack Yeti decks because a single Blight Moth could beat them, but it was also a good card against any non-tribal aggro or token deck, which made it a staple in most shadow decks, including even FTS or 5-faction Vox decks, in which it had additional synergy because shadows are nightmares, so they get buffed by Vox. In Fel midrange, even Sinan Katra, and Archenport Kira. It stayed relevant in Throne until its nerf thanks to the prevalence of 1/2 units like Grenadin Drone, Iaria Valkyrie Captain, or Hojang Groundbreaker. In Expedition it was also a staple. In most shadow decks it was an integral part of the aforementioned FTS Sacrifice deck in Z8, in which it was even better than in other decks because it offered 2 bodies for 1, so you could sacrifice both bodies for more value with cards like Kindling Carver, and because it was a great reanimation target for Aramod's Machinations thanks to its strong summon effect. Killing Carver or Card to the mirror match was a nice bonus too. In Z9 Expedition, Blight Moth continued to see play in a wide number of decks, for example FPS and FTS Sacrifice, Archenport Kira, or TGS Midrange, until it got nerfed at the end of the season. After mentioning the FTS Sacrifice deck so many times, anyone who played at the time has probably guessed our number 1 spot by now. It's of course Chek, Mercenary Hunter. He's a 3-power triple fire influence 2/3 legendary unit. On summon you can pay 1 and discard a card to deal 2 damage to 2 enemies. If you discarded a sigil, he gets double damage, so he deals 4 damage on summon already. And when he hits the opponent you get to draw a Treasure Trove, which is a factionless 2-power spell that draws a card. That means Chek was a 4-drop, not a 3-drop most of the time. You rarely wanted to just play him for 3 power, instead you paid the 1 extra to kill up the 2 enemy units and to maybe deal some damage to the opponent, which would then give you a trove. Discarding a sigil was a strong bonus and made Chek better in 2 faction decks because they could usually play more sigils, but it wasn't necessary for him to be good. He had a fair amount of Throne tops, the majority of them in Stormska aggro, and a few in Rakano Valkyries, FGS midrange, and a Monofire aggro, which won an ICQ in the hands of Sunnyvale. But a format that made Chek number 1 on this list was Expedition, especially Z8 Expedition. He dominated both the Spring Seasonal and the ICQ Shadow of the Spire right after his release in early May 2020. In the seasonal, he was played in 45 out of the 64 decks that reached day 2. The most important deck, the aforementioned FDA Sacrifice deck, took 7 spots of the top 8, and Chek was a huge reason for that. His ability to kill 2 units could swing around games fast, especially against other token or aggro decks with a lot of smaller units. And his additional synergy with cards like Aramot's Machinations made him one of the most important cards of the deck. Despite that, he was nerfed in the big nerf wave right after the Spring Seasonal, which meant that he remained the centerpiece of the format in the ICQ Shadow of the Spire 2 weeks after. The best proof for that is the deck that won that ICQ in the hands of Collector, Skycrack Midrange, or how it was known back then, Skycrack Chonkers. That name stems from the fact that the deck did not play any unit with less than 4 health except for Chek himself to try to blank the opponent's checks, which paid off big time. Chek was in 41 of 64 decks again, the majority of them Praxis Aggro, and Collector and many others had success with Skycrack Midrange because they just countered all the Chek decks very well. In Z9 Expedition, Chek was still an important part of the meta in decks like Skycrack, Stonescar and Monofire Aggro and FPS tokens, but he wasn't quite as aggressive anymore, mostly because Z9 had so many strong cards that Chek became less of an anomaly in terms of strength. This marks the end of the 10th episode of the Eternal Top 10 series. You can find the introduction video and the previous episodes on my channel. Thanks everyone for tuning in. Have a nice week.